when I was in school, when I was a kid, in the 70s and 80s, um, calculators were actually kind of new, right? The idea of just a calculator, and it was a bit novel. And there was even a period where I remember taught, like I was a kid, so I just fully embraced this stuff. Like, this is technology. This is how we do this. I can offload my brain. I don't have to do, these types of things, these types of calculations. But I remember being shocked talking to somebody who was much older at the time, this engineer who was in his 50s, and I was in my teens. And he described, yeah, I don't trust the calculator. I'm always going to go back and do the math myself. I might use it to double check the calculator. That just struck me as insane, right? And of course, by today's standards, it is totally insane. But the point I'm making is, like, the calculator, this totally ubiquitous thing, has freed us from having to think about a certain class of problems. And I think that the generative AI is going to do the same sort of thing, but the class of problems that it is freeing us from having to think about is much, much larger.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Product Unfiltered. Today, we are thrilled to have a special guest, Chris Jones, partner at Silicon Valley Product Group. Chris has spent over 30 years building and leading product teams that define new product categories at startups to Fortune 500 software companies, including Lookout, Symantec, and Want2. Since joining Silicon Valley Product Group, Chris has worked directly with over 200 companies, ranging from startups to very large enterprises across a very wide variety of technologies. Chris specializes in product leadership, including product strategy, product design, management, development, and data analytics. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us at Product Unfiltered.
Thanks. That was a very generous introduction.
So, Chris, can you tell us more about Silicon Valley Product Group and your role there as a product partner? We would also love to understand, why did you choose consulting as your area of focus?
Yeah, sure. So Silicon Valley Product Group is a relatively small consultancy. There are about a half a dozen partners in the practice. We're all former heads of product at various sorts of companies. It was established about 20-ish years ago by Marty Kagan, who is it's a name that's relatively well known among product circles. Marty has been active writing for a very, very long time. He founded Silicon Valley Product Group, in the early part of the 2000s, and has kind of slowly grown that practice. We are about working, with individuals and companies who are trying to get more closely aligned with what's called the product model, right? It's sort of an operating model of product development that is very centered around the product, around the customer, those sorts of things. So, we tend to engage with both big companies and small companies that are in various stages of a transformation, trying to get more aligned with that sort of thing. So I think that was the first part of your question for Silicon Valley Product Group. For me as a consultant, I've kind of gone in and out of consulting throughout my career. In my early days, I did have a rather long period of being a consultant. And then I went into several operational roles in product management and product leadership. And then, since about 2015 is when I joined Silicon Valley Product Group. So it's another long stint now, going into consulting. In terms of my career, I've really enjoyed going back and forth, actually, going from a consulting role and spending some time there to actually going into an operational role and spending some time there. The consulting roles are really good for, of course, this depends on the nature of the practice that you're a part of. But for me, it has involved being able to see a lot of different things from a very high up perspective. And you just get a lot of sort of horizontal learning, when you compare and contrast different situations, across different customers. And I've really enjoyed that. It's actually something that I think that's helped me grow and helped me just, develop my mind, around product. but it does lack, some of the things that the operational roles give you. The operational roles allow you to go really deep. Allows you to build and have a team. To really have your hands on the wheel as far as the product that's that's coming out there. So I've liked both modes. At this point in my life, the SVPG work has worked quite well, and it's been really quite fulfilling. I think I can say one other thing here, on this topic, and it basically has to do with the part of product that has always appealed to me personally. And that has been like, I was okay, pretty good on the actual creating of product stuff. But what I really felt a lot of affinity toward was building the teams of people who actually built the products. I always considered that to be my product. That was this engine of product within a company. Was the thing that I always got the most excited about. So it was about, getting the right people in, getting them placed, designing an organization, setting up incentives and measures in ways that inspired people to work, managing people, developing people, that sort of thing. So that was always my favorite part. And one of the just wonderful things about Silicon Valley Product Group is that that's most of what I do now is sort of coach companies on how to do that and how to repeat some of the experiences that I've had.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So, Chris, you have been building products from 90s, like you have entered the corporate world from 90s. So we would also like to understand, how has product management evolved from 90s to till date? What are some of the key differences which you see?
When I first entered, kind of technology, when I left school, basically I graduated in the early 90s and my degree was in computer science. And, I kind of started on the engineering side of things. I'd say what would be the big things about the 90s? First of all, there really wasn't the same focus on either data or user experience, right? Those were things that were relatively, data and especially big data, that really wasn't on the scene yet. I think I read somewhere that the first time that data science appeared as a job title in LinkedIn, I think was like 2007, 2008, something like that, right? So this was not a thing. In the 90s, AI meant something completely different. It was these old, heuristic, decision systems and things like that. So that was just not present at all. And then I'd say the focus on design and UX was a relatively new thing. There were a few people who got it. I did some work with a number of companies, to try and develop that capacity and that muscle. I suppose, one other thing that is particularly important is that at the beginning of the 90s, there was no World Wide Web, right? There was an internet and there was email, but, things like, even just simple websites and web pages really didn't, come online in any sort of big way until, the middle of that decade. And that was actually one of the trends that I ended up, kind of riding. I had a small consultancy. That was my first stint as a consultant. I had a small company that was working with other companies on kind of how to cope with this new technology, basically.
Yeah. And Chris, while you have worked with so many companies as a consultant, what are some core challenges which you see which product managers in these companies face? And what are some strategies which you share to tackle those challenges?
So you're asking about kind of individual product managers? What are the challenges within those companies?
Yeah, the product managers and the product teams.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of our bread and butter, right? That's really where Silicon Valley Product Group starts, and kind of where we plug in with these companies. One of the main things that we're trying to help companies do is figure out ways to truly empower those teams. And by empower, I mean, rather than we are giving them things to build, right? You have a team there and you say, okay, look, we need this solution, on behalf of this particular stakeholder within the company. What really happens in these within the modern product operating model is you're giving teams problems to solve, and you're truly empowering them to come up with what the best solution to that problem is going to be. So that's really where a lot of the coaching happens. This is something that's particularly easy to say, but very, very difficult to do, especially with larger companies. So, when we engage, we tend to be talking with the leadership of those companies. So sometimes up to the CEO, but certainly whoever the head of product, head of design, or head of engineering are. Those are the people that we're actually working with. In terms of kind of advice for product managers who are working in those kind of old style companies, it's there are some things you can do for sure as an individual product manager, but at the end of the day, you're always going to be subject to the operating model that you're working inside of, right? So, your manager is measured on certain things. There are certain flows in the process internally, and those things are going to incentivize certain behaviors and de-incentivize other behaviors. So, there is some latitude that an individual product manager can exert, but in many cases, it's going to take a much more concerted effort to get aligned with the product model.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris, the next question is something which is always concerning aspiring product managers. That while building products, how do you define a successful product? What are some of the factors that you consider that, okay, if we have checked box these parameters, then my product is successful?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a really varied answer to that, depending on what your product team is doing. But I think to give you a less squishy answer than that, it really has to do with are people choosing to use it, right? I mean, if you actually delivered value, are they, when given a choice, when presented with a choice, are they choosing you? Whether that means to buy your thing or to use your thing. So there are, of course, metrics you can tie to all of that. But, ultimately, if you don't have a product that is, that people are using and want to use, then you haven't created value, right? You haven't delivered any value.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So let's move on to the next segment of our podcast, the game of products. So in this segment, we'll dive into the world of successful and not so successful products. We'll give you the name of the company or the product, and we would love to hear your one-liner or two-liner takes on why do you think the company was successful or the product was successful or a failure.
All right.
So let's start with Adobe.
Adobe is a company, or Adobe as a specific product there?
Adobe as a company.
Okay. Well, Adobe has a lot of successes and a lot of failures. So there are, that company's been around for a while. People would call it a tech company, but it's very much a legacy company. It has its origins in desktop software. It has dominated a number of categories. So it's actually done a really good job of providing value. It also was one of the most interesting case studies in transformation, as they moved, in the, what was it, 2010-ish, they moved from the Creative Suite to the Creative Cloud. That was a massive undertaking that company took on. And actually it's often looked at as kind of a success story. Obviously there's mileage varies across, kind of individual areas of success, but what they did in terms of the technological transformation, the go-to-market transformation, moving from something that was a license and renewal and upgrade model to something that was a pure SaaS model. Right now we don't think of that as particularly innovative, but at the time that was an incredibly bold move, and the company did well. On the other hand, there are parts of their product line where they have allowed themselves to get disrupted. Canva is a good example. The fact that they are trying to buy Figma, I think is an example that they might have missed some particular opportunities. So I'd say probably right now, this wasn't a 1 or 2 line answer, sorry. I think particularly right now, they're probably in need of kind of a good hard look again on, kind of portfolio wide, where they're playing, but they've certainly demonstrated that they're a company that's capable of doing some pretty dramatic transformation.
Yeah. And
what do you guys think? Actually, I'm curious what you guys think of Adobe.
I mean, so our idea of putting Adobe as a successful company was they have been in a particular domain for so long and they have been leading it from the front. So that's really inspiring to see that you take a domain and then you become a leader. And it's very much like you have monopolized the whole market, wherein if anyone
Yeah.
wants to come in the creative suite softwares, they come to Adobe.
Right. Well, here's an interesting question, though, just to kind of play with this a little bit. In terms of creative professionals, they absolutely own that market, and they have for decades, right? There's just no question what is the primary tool suite you're going to use if you're actually a creative professional. But for the long tail of people who, what it means to be a creative professional, like if you were in the 90s or the early 2000s, you were trained in a certain thing, you had a job around a certain thing, you could spend, $1,500, for an app like that once a year. That was all part of it. But, clearly because of what technology has done, there are many, many other people who are now designers. Some of them are professional-ish, some of them are full-fledged professionals. And that's the part of the market where, I think it's a little bit less clear, how good a job Adobe has done. And I think there are some successes and there's some misses. So, but yeah, I would put them predominantly on the success side of the ledger, but I don't think it's an unmitigated success.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's that Adobe, there's always a notion that Adobe is meant for people who are very professional and well trained to use the tools. And if you see the recent launches of Adobe in the cloud experience, they have built a recent new product for podcasters, which is very easy to use. You don't need any training to do that. It's completely automated. So they might be coming to the industry where they'll help.
Oh no, they've been looking at that part of the industry for a long time. But yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
And at the very same time, like Adobe has a few successes in the professional designing industry. We see players like Canva coming in and solving the issues and problems of amateurs or early stage designers who want to get into the market. So curious how Adobe will actually see this competition coming in.
Yeah, well, so I'm getting into a place where I can't actually fully talk about all of these things, but there's no question that Canva is a threat, to certain parts of Adobe's business. And I think what we would advise any company, in these stages is that, you've got to know your customers, you've got to know the market, you've got to be, ruthlessly experimenting, trying lots of different things, figuring out, what's actually going to work, and ultimately carving out the part of the market that you're going to own and making sure that you do it. So there's some real work. They of course are responding, and they do have some products in those markets, but they're not leading in the same way that Canva is.
Mm-hmm. The third part was our second product was Canva. And we have had a few discussion around it. So if you want to add a few pointers, we can do that, or we can move to the next product.
Let's. I think we've done this one. Okay. Yeah, let's move on.
So the next product is the infamous Apple iPhone.
All right. Well, I mean, what can you say about that, right? I mean, it is. I mean, it's famous or infamous. I think it's famous, but by many metrics, the most successful product ever launched, right? And also one that has just dramatically changed. It's changed everything, right? I mean, it's changed the industry, but it's changed how we interact with one another socially. It's given rise to so many things. And none of these are unequivocally good or bad. So I'm not sure if I put iPhone in the hero or the villain category, but it's really hard to argue that it's not, just an amazingly successful product. What is kind of interesting for me is if you were around at the time that the iPhone came out, in the 2006 to 2010, range or so, it was not like the obvious success, right? In fact, it had a lot of dissenters, early on. There were a couple of things. One I think was a really shrewd strategic decision by Apple, and the other one was just kind of hammering a vision, from Apple. So, one thing that was, part of the early adoption of the product, it was very much oriented toward consumers. and did not have a lot of the capabilities in it that it would need in order to be adopted by enterprises. And it took quite a while, and it actually allowed many people on the hater side to just kind of throw a lot of shade on Apple because it just was never going, in their minds, it was never going to be the business phone. Clearly that got solved, and this was something that was always part of Apple's discipline. We were going after this market first, and then we're going to move in this direction. But the other one is the whole idea of a touchscreen. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine the world before a touchscreen because they are so ubiquitous. You cannot buy a smartphone now, pretty much that isn't geared entirely around a touchscreen. But for a long time, people, the BlackBerries, people loved their hard keys. They wanted that tactile feel, and there were a number of transitional products, especially on the Android side, that kind of had both. Right, there was this big touchscreen, but you also had some hard keys, and ultimately that was something that people thought, yeah, it's not going to happen. It's just too icky of an experience to be interacting with a piece of glass as opposed to something that clicks and taps and whatnot. But we all see where that ended up, and people don't talk about hard keys at all anymore.
True.
Yeah.
So the next product for you, Chris, is Zoom.
Zoom. Okay. Let's see. I think before the pandemic, Zoom had a reputation of being the absolute easiest of the video conferencing. Like it was really easy to get onboarded. It was really easy to set up a connection. Some of those things turned out to be, problematic from a privacy and security standpoint, some of the things that allowed Zoom to do that. But there was a period where Zoom was lauded as being, a company that really had the user experience absolutely dialed for something that is, otherwise kind of fiddly, right? So, and then of course they were standing in exactly the right place when the pandemic happened. They just heaped lots and lots of growth on there. I think they, you got to give them credit for being there and absorbing that demand and actually helping the world through, a period where it was transitioning to a very different mode of work. So, pretty big contribution there. Everything I've kind of seen since, it strikes me as a company that really doesn't have a whole lot of a plan. It's kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall on productivity and calendaring, and they've even got like a word processing thing and AI and all of this. And I'm having a hard time seeing the fit there. I'm having a hard time imagining that any user is going to shift their center of gravity away from whatever their desktop, productivity suite is to Zoom. I think they probably need to do something in order to figure out where the next, kind of growth is going to come from. But a lot of the stuff they've been doing recently has been, it's been a kind of a head scratcher for me. Like, here's an example. Like the first thing I do now, like I did it for this call. There's that tool ribbon on the right side of the window with all these little apps. And I honestly don't know what any of those things do. The first thing I do is just close that because I just find it distracting.
Yeah.
So, I think they strike me as a little bit rudderless right now.
Yeah. And Chris, while you were talking about Zoom, like Zoom was able to capitalize on the pandemic opportunity which they got, and they were able to, launch products in the education domain and many other enterprise domains. But what do you think is the next big opportunity for Zoom? If you would give your thoughts.
Yeah, this sort of thing is not necessarily my forte. Is kind of that kind of prognosticating. I suppose it has less to do with, for me anyway, I guess it has less to do with new kind of capabilities and sort of technology and things like that, and more to do with go to market, kind of how to reach perhaps different audiences, different places that they haven't penetrated. But I don't know much about the specifics of the business to go there. You guys are getting me thinking about it.
And Chris, now we have talked about few successful products. So we would like to now discuss some products which have not been that successful. So let's flip the script to so the next product is Yahoo.
Yeah. So, Yahoo was really early to the internet game. They tried to organize the internet in the early days. They had a paradigm that really wasn't set up for the explosive growth that happened. It was all very librarian and curated. We curate the internet so that we can provide a unified kind of browsing interface on top of it. And yeah, they were in great shape for a while, and then they kind of lost that in terms of search. They did end up spinning up a number of businesses, some of which on the news side were successful. They did do some things around portals and tools. I think they're one that got into, I guess, just a bit of a complacent posture around innovation. And when Marissa Mayer came in as their kind of that last CEO before they sold to Verizon, that was one of the very first things that she basically was hired to kind of re-energize them as the innovative engine that they were, right? I mean, they were definitely one of the big Silicon Valley companies. And one of the things she did, this is kind of ironic now in our post-pandemic or our pandemic mindset, but one of the very first things she did was shut down their work from home policy, right? They were one of the very early companies that had a very liberal policy around work from home, and a lot of people got very much into that. And if you know anything about Marissa Mayer, she's always been about we need the deep cross-functional collaboration, which means we need these people together, which means you need to get your butts back to the office. So, her first act there was to try and clamp down on that. And then there were some other things that kind of distracted the company, when that whole acquisition was some privacy things, some security things that were really kind of unfortunate. It would have been interesting to see that first story play out. She's somebody who is very well known, for being able to create those sorts of engines of innovation that I was talking about before. It would have been interesting to see that story play out, and if she would have been able to turn that company around.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing all these great insights. So now we would love to shift some gears and get some insights about what is happening in the industry right now. So as you know, generative AI has been the big hot thing in the product management, in the tech industry. So something which we are really curious to know is that generative AI is becoming more and more prevalent in the current tech industry. So how do you see it impacting different industries, and which one do you believe will be completely disrupted?
Wow. I don't know if I have a real precise answer on this. I believe, let me say this. I don't think we have any idea yet, where all of the generative AI is going to land, both in terms of the sorts of products that we're going to see, but also in terms of its impact on, industries, society, kind of how we interact with one another, what it means to go to school, really, really fundamental things. I believe, and I don't think this is hyperbolic to say, I actually think that generative AI is going to have as much of an impact on society as mobile did, as the iPhone did, maybe perhaps more, because it's, I can sort of see it getting into a lot more places. Actually, it's hard to imagine how there would be much more than mobile. How do you even measure that? But I think it's going to be, an impact that is easily that profound. I wouldn't even describe myself as a super heavy user. I'm still kind of dabbling and kind of figuring it out. But when certain questions occur to me, or when I want to have somebody debate me on a point or something like that, just starting to use the tool for that, and this is just mind blowing, the types of things that can be done. And I think there are going to be some industries that are going to be in terms of workers, are probably going to be pretty heavily decimated. Like, I don't think it's going to ever fully replace all workers, within an industry, but it might make some workers so much more productive than they ever were that there'll be, a lot of casualties there. But these things also are very, sort of accretive in terms of new work opportunities and just things that we haven't even imagined before. So I think we're kind of sitting, we're sitting at like, where 2007 was, with mobile. That's really where we're sitting right now, maybe even a little earlier with generative AI. So yeah, I don't have a specific place, but I don't think there's going to be too many places that are untouched.
But Chris, the type of hyper growth which the generative AI space is bringing, do you think such growth is sustainable in the market?
I think that hyper growth, like, I'm not so focused on that. I think, I guess there is a statistic now that OpenAI, that product, ChatGPT, is like the fastest growing product in all history, right? Faster than the iPhone was.
Yeah.
I'm a little less sort of interested in that, because I think those things are going to go up and down. There's a certain amount of fattiness that's going on here as well. So I think that's a bit of a distraction for me. I think it's going to be more the slightly slower moving forces that are going to be the really interesting ones on kind of where all this stuff ends up, how it begins to transform certain industries. There are, like, I am sure that we are weeks away, from just more and more products that are going to come out that are going to be equally mind-blowing in terms of what can actually be done. Like, we just don't yet, as a society, even have the imagination to understand, what this type of technology can do. So yeah. Here's a metaphor that I don't think actually holds up that well, but and especially it goes all the way back to your question about the 90s, right? So I'm just going to be the old man on this on this podcast. But when I was in school, when I was a kid, in the 70s and 80s, calculators were actually kind of new, right? The idea of just a calculator, and it was a bit novel. And there was even a period where I remember I was a kid, so I just fully embraced this stuff. Like, this is technology. This is how we do this. I can offload my brain. I don't have to do, these types of things, these types of calculations. But I remember being shocked talking to, somebody who was much older at the time, this engineer who was in his 50s, and I was in my teens. And he described, I don't trust the calculator. I'm always going to go back and do the math myself. I might use it to double check the calculator. That just struck me as insane, right? And of course, by today's standards, it is totally insane. But the point I'm making is, like, the calculator, this totally ubiquitous thing, has freed us from having to think about a certain class of problems. And I think the generative AI is going to do the same sort of thing, but the class of problems that it is freeing us from having to think about is much, much larger. Many of the things that my kid is doing in high school, ChatGPT can do a lot of them better than my kid right now. So what is that going to mean, for us as a society, if we no longer have to do as much on those types of things, in the same way that we don't have to, we got to learn how to do our basic arithmetic and, exponent math and all of that stuff, but then we can forget it because, we got a calculator here that's going to always do it. What's going to happen when that comes together for forming an argument or, a logical position about something, so these are just profound forces, right? And I think, I just think that there's a lot yet to be written on that.
And Chris, while you were talking about, as a product manager, you have to ensure that you learn the language of engineering as well as business, because these are all the stakeholders which you interact with on a day-to-day basis. It's equally important to stay up to the latest trends and technologies and what is happening in the market. So how do you stay up to date on industry trends and emerging technologies? And what process do you use to ensure that you are always learning and growing in this field?
Yeah, no, it's great. This is something we advise people on as well. I've got my diet of media, that I'm following. I've got a few particular podcasts that I will follow. I've got a number of kind of newsletters and kind of analysts that I follow. One of my favorite ones, if you guys aren't already familiar with him, is Ben Thompson. He started off predominantly writing. He's doing a lot of podcasting now as well. But I've been following him since his very first article, and just incredibly insightful stuff out there. Now he will get it somewhat into technology, but he's usually a step later than that. He's going to be talking largely about industries and kind of how technology and strategy intersect. So so that's one that I like. Let's see, in terms of podcasts, yeah, I mean, there's a whole set of them, but let's see if I could put a couple out there that I particularly like. Well, there are two that are somewhat offsetting, right? Because one, they tend to have political spins on them, and one is a little left and one's a little right, and it's interesting to kind of hear and put those two together. So the left one would be Pivot, which is the one that Kara Swisher does with Scott Galloway. And then there's the right one, which is the All In, which is a bunch of Silicon Valley financiers who get pretty right. So you gotta figure out where you sit on all of that stuff. But yeah, I just have a regular diet, and I think that's important to be just staying up on that. If there's a particular technology that comes around, it's so easy to be curious on it, right? It's so easy. You just ask GPT now. Can you summarize this for me at an 8th grade level? Can you summarize this for me at a 10th grade level? Whatever it is that you want to come at, and then of course lots and lots of videos. So if there's something that you've been hearing about, as a product manager that you think you should learn a little bit about, you don't actually have to go to a course. You can probably do it in a couple of hours.
Yeah. Hopefully soon Product Unfiltered will be in your list, Chris.
Exactly. No, it is. No, I definitely enjoy what you guys are doing.
Thanks, Chris. So this brings us to the end of today's episode. Hope all of you have enjoyed today's episode and our discussion has helped learn something new. Stay tuned for more such exciting episodes. Thank you so much for tuning into Product Unfiltered.
Thanks, guys.